It's high on a mountain, the warm winds are blowing, and where the winds are blowing to, there ain't no way of knowing. The mountain grass is short, it's dry and close to burning, crying out for water as the season's turning. Sweet smell of the pines, tall western cedar, drifting on the wind through the mountains like a river.
Hello, this is Ayana Young, and I welcome you to Unlearn and Rewild, where we explore radical ideas relating to Earth renewal. Many of the points of view expressed on this program, such as the need for a deep psychological reintegration in the natural world, or abandoning economic and political systems based on the domination of nature, are not new, and occasionally the selective memory of history fails to completely erase such voices. Today we're going to dig up the writings of a mystic philosopher who was born in Germany over 750 years ago. We're joined by his preeminent spokesperson of the 21st century, speaking with us from Oakland, California, Matthew Fox. Matthew might well be the most creative and most comprehensive, surely the most challenging religious spiritual teacher in America. He's been renewing the ancient mystical tradition of creation spirituality, founding the University of Creation Spirituality in Oakland, which incorporates Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Sufi, Native American, Goddess, Hindu traditions, as well as ecology, social justice, feminist theory, and art. Fox's effort to reawaken the West to its own mystical tradition has included revivifying awareness of Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, Thomas Aquinas, and the cosmic Christ tradition, as well as interacting with contemporary scientists who are also mystics. He has authored 30 books, including 2 books with British biologist Rupert Sheldrake, and has worked closely with Native American leaders such as Buck Ghosthorse. Welcome, and thank you for speaking with us, Matthew.
Thank you. Good to be on your program.
So, you've been described as a postmodern theologian. What exactly does that mean?
I wish I knew. But, well, it means that, the modern era is famous for accomplishing a lot of things like electricity and getting to the moon and back, and Newtonian science and all that. But as we know, the modern era has also cost us a lot, because the modern era, I identify it with its launch with the invention of the printing press in the late 15th century. It oriented our thinking in the West toward text. And this narrows our vision, because text is an anthropocentric thing. It's what humans create in printing presses and all the rest. And that's not a bad thing, but when it cuts us off from the rest of the universe and really shrinks our souls, and our whole world then becomes an anthropocentric world, then we're in deep trouble. And I think that's what's happened, and I think it's one reason education is, what can I say, is as inadequate today as it is, and we're scurrying to try to rediscover our relationship to nature itself, and of course to the whole cosmos. So postmodern science, as David Bohm said, the physicist, it begins with a whole, W-H-O-L-E, not with a part, which modern science began with. And so the recovery of cosmology and the story of how we got here and where here is in the universe, both in terms of time, 13.8 billion years, and in terms of space, we're only one galaxy among hundreds of billions of galaxies, all this resets our project as a species. And it's very exciting and very awesome, very beautiful, and of course it's a reminder of how dangerous we can be as a species, because if we're running around doing our economics and our farming and our education and our religion and our politics just in a bubble of human-centered values, then, of course, we bring down the rest of creation. That's exactly what's happening today with climate change and with the disappearance of so many species. This kind of disappearance hasn't happened in 65 million years. And it's our species that is really the cause here. So we have to wake up and wake up fast to a postmodern awareness, which is that the world does not revolve around humans, and our agendas. We're part of a much bigger interdependent web of life and the responsibility that goes with it.
I'd like to get into your new book, Meister Eckhart, Mystic Warrior for Our Times. Could you give us a brief explanation of who was Meister Eckhart and how his teachings might help reroute our society?
One dimension to modern consciousness is, of course, the notion that pre-modern people were illiterate or they didn't know what they were doing or something, but in fact, of course, your indigenous people and your pre-modern people, including the medieval world where Eckhart comes from, at least they were not anthropocentric. They were struck by the awe and the wonder and the grace of nature. That's exactly something we have to recover today. So postmodern awareness is aware that, while our modern ancestors went around the world wiping out all kinds of indigenous wisdom and people, we can't do that anymore. We have to call on pre-modern wisdom. And a big part of pre-modern wisdom is the marriage of psyche and cosmos. And this is where Meister Eckhart comes in, because he has, in terms of religion, a very well-developed understanding of what we call the cosmic Christ. It's not just about Jesus saving an individual soul. It's about the patterns of the universe, that Christ is a pattern that connects. So too is the Buddha nature. So if you come from another culture, there are other names for this. He was a theologian now, born in 1260 in Germany, as you mentioned, and he was 13 when Rumi died. So he was, you might say, a late peer of Rumi. And Hafiz, the Sufi poet who came right after Rumi, he and Eckhart were contemporaries. And Eckhart was also very much alive during the time that the Kabbalah, the great Jewish mystical book, was being written. He was 17 years old when Thomas Aquinas died. And Eckhart was a Dominican, and Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. I also was a Dominican until the Pope fired me after 34 years. But Eckhart stood on the shoulders of Aquinas, and Aquinas spent his whole life bringing Aristotle, the best scientist he could find, into the medieval church. And this was a great big breakthrough, and it was very, very revolutionary. But Aquinas said a mistake about creation is also a mistake about God, so we need science to tell us about creation, and that itself opens up our minds in a much fuller way to the role of divinity and the sacred in creation. So Eckhart was a great preacher in his day, and he worked with the Beguines, the women's movement of his day. He got in trouble for that. He worked with the peasants. In fact, he was the first intellectual to preach in the German vernacular, which was the peasant dialects, and he got in trouble for that. So he was an activist. He worked with the poor, he worked with the women, because the Beguines were a very strong women movement that threatened the papacy very much. But he developed a theology and a mysticism that was essentially about experience, the experiential side of religion, not the dogmatic, doctrinal, structural side of religion. And that's another way he got in trouble, because mystics invariably get in trouble with institutional keepers of the status quo. So in his old age, he was called to a trial in Avignon where the Pope lived, and they condemned some of his work a week after he died. And because of that condemnation, his work kind of went underground and never really influenced mainstream Christianity, which is a real shame, but it came up and influenced some major thinkers through the world, including, you see it in George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, because of the combination of the contemplative and the active that Eckhart was pushing. You see it in Karl Marx. Ernst Bloch, the Marxist philosopher, says Eckhart was an influence on Marx because of his passion for justice. And Carl Jung says that he owes the key to the unconscious to Meister Eckhart. And as I point out in this book, Eckhart has so much in common with Sufis, with Buddhists, with the Jewish tradition, with the feminist tradition. He had a real awareness of the divine feminine, not just the patriarchal masculine. And even the Hindu tradition. So I have chapters on each of these impacts that Eckhart has, because it's Hindus who say Eckhart reading, it's Kumaraswamy, the Hindu said reading Eckhart is like reading the Upanishads. Well, that's incredible praise from a Hindu. And it was a Buddhist, Dr. Suzuki, who said that Eckhart is a one Zen thinker of the West. And Sufis have written me letters saying Eckhart was a Sufi. So he's amazingly ecumenical. He's amazingly interfaith. And of course, this is a big part of postmodernism too, to bring together various traditions of wisdom and not just hide in our little boxes of tribalism, saying that my God is better than your God and my God can beat up your goddess. That's not how our species is going to survive.
Well, speaking about these various traditions and beliefs, as displaced people in North America, we're living in a spiritually diverse land, and we have the challenge of trying to reconnect with our ancestral tradition, our blood tradition, or the tradition of our homeland. So how can we navigate this confusion of finding an authentic spirituality?
Well, that's a real good question, and I think that you have to look for really solid guides, and Eckhart is among the best. But he speaks in a language that is very electric, that really captures one's heart, because he works from intuition much more than rationality as such. So he really speaks to a very broad audience. For example, he says, I pray God to rid me of God. Well, that kind of shocks you, and it gets you thinking deeply about, hey, what are the false gods that we're worshiping in our culture or in our religions at this time? It says, what does God do all day long? God lies in a maternity bed giving birth. So that parallels today's understanding of the universe, that the universe is radically creative. After all, a star has been born every 15 seconds. And Eckhart is confirming that with theological language, that creativity is at the heart of the universe. Therefore, if we're going to be real, and if we're going to fit into the patterns of the universe and the habits of the universe, we ought to really up the ante on our creativity. So he has so much to say that I think speak to people today in this postmodern world about diversity, about creativity, about the earth. He says that every creature is a word of God and a book about God. In other words, we should get our nose out of just the holy books, our various scriptures, whether they're the Bible or the Quran or the Upanishads or whatnot. They have something to teach, but so too does the book of nature. And every creature is a book about God. That means every creature is a Bible, is a sacred text that is speaking to us. And the suffering of the creatures today is the suffering of the Christ all over again. That's what the cosmic Christ tradition is saying, that the Christ is present in every being in the universe. It's a light in every being. And science today says there are photons or light waves in every atom in the universe. So the Christ is a light in every being, but also the wounds in every being. That whole archetype of the crucifixion, that all beings suffer, as the Buddhists say.
Now the raging of the forest fires end, and all the mammals fled. I smell in the charred darkness a little green, a little red. When you sang your song, your voice washed over the scene. Glacial runoff, a beautiful blue light came over me, came over me. Drink deep, my love for the water is gasping for your mouth, gasping for your mouth. Drink deep.
It seems that much of our American spirituality or religious tradition is a subset of a consumer framework, and it maintains the story of separation from each other. It's more about buying the accessories, the namaste water bottle, the Buddha home decor, and this self-awareness is a huge handicap. It validates our egocentrism and herd individuality, just as capitalism itself does. Meister Eckhart wasn't comfortable sitting in an ivory tower or on a yoga mat just writing about justice and connection, but he was in the streets. He was speaking truth to power. He was serving the poor. And just like Jesus, this was a source of his charisma and influence. There aren't many mystics today who are as devoted to action, and there are even fewer activists who are devoted to the mystical experience. So I'm wondering what you imagine him saying to some modern-day guru that teaches shutting out the noise of the outside world for the sake of inner peace, i.e., shutting out the environmental inferno around us and the social breakdown, and just fixating on self-help, self-affection, and consumer spirituality?
That's a great question, because you really nailed something that's very prevalent. I mean, it just shows how the dominant religion of America is consumerism. It's consumer capitalism at this time in history. And it can suck in like a black hole. It can suck in everything around it, including talk and even some practices of spirituality. Eckhart would not tolerate that. Eckhart says that the person who understands what I say about justice understands everything I have to say. Now, how many mystics in world history can talk that way? And he says compassion means justice. So he gets that from the Jewish prophetic tradition. The compassion is not just about feeling sweet for others or feeling pity for others, not at all. It is about creating social opportunities and structures that allow justice to flow like a river. So what we need today is a kind of dance that Eckhart had, which is that of contemplation and action, so that our action is not just out of reaction, which is reptilian brain stuff, but it's out of the Easterners call non-action, or what the West we would call being, that action comes from being or from non-action. And to find being, of course, you do have to go into silence. You do have to develop that contemplative side of the brain, which is, of course, the compassion side of the brain is the mammal brain. We have to move beyond this reptilian brain that just wants to act and react. But there's another dimension that Eckhart addresses apropos of your observation, and that is about consumer capitalism. I believe that consumerism is a secular version of original sin ideology. Because original sin ideology, which has dominated Western Christianity since the 4th century, teaches us that you're born this big sinner, and it's kind of downhill from there. But the creation spiritual tradition, which Eckhart is part of, begins not with original sin, but original blessing. That the universe is good and very good, and we are part of it, and we are blessings too. But if you think that you are born a sinner, then you're always looking for outside salvation. And in terms of capitalism, that's about buying things. You buy till you drop. You buy till you die. And that's how to cut through some of that ideology, to realize that there's an ideology present in consumer capitalism about buying your way out of trouble that is very parallel to the ideology of original sin. And Eckhart throws both off. He gave a very major sermon because they were building this big Gothic, gingerbread Gothic cathedral in his time. It still exists in Cologne. And it was half done when he was there. And he got up at this half-done cathedral, and he took the text from Jesus driving money lenders from the temple. And he said that the only temple that counts is the temple of the human soul. And that we can be merchants trying to get things from God, or trying to show off, as you said, our ego, strutting our egos by what we purchase, but that Jesus would be throwing these money lenders out of the temple. Well, this did not endear him to the bishops or the bankers or the people who were sponsoring this temple, this Gothic cathedral, at all. And in fact, a trial followed on that sermon in Cologne itself against Eckhart because he had stepped on the toes. He also said that everyone is an aristocrat, and he said that to peasants in their own languages. This did not endear him to the aristocrats. And he said, we're all aristocrats because we're all born so nobly. So again, that idea of original blessing, not original sin. I think that Eckhart addresses this issue of consumerism at a very deep level, both theologically, philosophically, and psychologically. And I think we all have to cut through that to be empowered. And that was his point, too, that not only are you another Christ, which he speaks of often, or in Eastern languages say another Buddha. But with this nobility, and that's the word he uses, nobility, comes responsibility. And we have to interact with the rest of creation, which is an original blessing, and to allow other creatures their rights. And obviously, we want creation to flourish and be healthy for many, many generations to come. So there is a whole eco-theology in Eckhart. It is an affront to consumerism and capitalism, and let's just call it passive mysticism or passive spirituality that is just about finding your own private bliss or something. Eckhart is not about private bliss. He is about the resurrection of the whole, not just of the individual. And he sees all of creation as both endangered, but also blessed and capable of rebirth, renewal.
It seems that God used to be such a huge part of life, and the psychological void that God has left behind is like capitalism has just filled this void in us. And it also seems that people are running in droves to the greener grasses of the East for spiritual guidance. And you quote Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, if we can bring into Christianity the insight of interbeing and non-duality, we will radically transform the way people look at the Christian tradition, and the valuable jewels in the Christian tradition will be rediscovered. Can you speak on this?
Yes, I think that quote from Thich Nhat Hanh is amazing, as many of his quotes are. He has a lot of insight about Christianity in the West, after all, he's been living in France for decades. And of course, he was a victim of Western imperialism in his home country of Vietnam, too. But he also recognizes that, yeah, there are real treasures in Christianity, as there are in all religions. But you have to unpack them, that they've been covered up by a lot of accretions over the centuries. He's emphasizing their non-dualism and interbeing. And of course, this is what Eckhart is about, too. He talks often about the interconnectivity of all things, which is, of course, today's postmodern science as well. So once again, our postmodern worldview has more in common with a pre-modern worldview than it does with a modern worldview. Now, it's not about reverting romantically to the pre-modern, to medieval, or even to indigenous exclusively, but it's opening our eyes to how some of the healing coming out from under the price we paid for modern awareness, a lot of this healing can come from pre-modern awareness. And the one thing is interbeing. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the apophatic divinity. And the apophatic divinity is the God of darkness. Eckhart talks about the God of is supersexual darkness, who has no name and will never be given a name. And so that's a side to divinity that you rarely hear about in West. But it's there. It's there in Eckhart. It's there in the great mystics. John the Cross has it too, and others. It's a celebration of our ignorance, really. It's a celebration of how divinity is beyond the names we put on our coins and God we trust, or our dollar bills, or our MX missiles. It's something much more mysterious and bigger than we can project, but we can make up names for. And it's interesting, Thich Nhat Hanh gives credit to Paul Tillich, the German theologian of the 20th century, for this phrase, God as the ground of being and the apophatic divinity. But in fact, Tillich knew Eckhart very well. Tillich got that from Eckhart. Again, Eckhart brings in this dimension to divinity that renders us more silent and more humble, and to cease our preconceptions and to let the experience of interbeing, of silence, of connection, and darkness, to let it flow. And of course, given today's science, it is telling us that 97% of all matter and energy are dark matter, dark energy. Clearly, we're moving into a time in terms of scientific awareness where darkness is taking on a much bigger meaning and a much bigger presence. Therefore, the apophatic divinity tradition, such as Eckhart represents very strongly, is coming into its own. And of course, Buddhism itself often refuses to talk about God. Thich Nhat Hanh uses the word God quite a lot, but many Buddhists do not. And this is another way of practicing the epiphatic divinity, not to overuse that name, God.
The word God feels like it's lost some power, and...
Oh yeah, it gets reduced to our projections. Here's an example. I met a rainforest native person, Indian from the Philippines years ago. She told me this story that a Catholic sister was working with her tribe once in the rainforest, and the sister asked her, "What's the biggest mistake we Westerners have made with you native people?" And they thought it was a good question, so they went away for 3 days and 3 nights to discuss it and get a consensus in the tribe. They came back and they said, "You Westerners, you put God in a little white house, and the rest of creation you treat however you like." So I thought that was an amazing statement about Western abuse and misuse of God talk. That, well, just what they're saying, that we've separated God from creation. And it's a pretty major separation when you think about it, because then we secularize everything. You see, then we can rape the earth to our consumer capitalism's content. We kill all the whales and kill all the rainforests and everything else that's going on, because there's nothing sacred out there anymore. We've locked God up in a little white house, you see, in some kind of sacred little precinct, while we go on and do our thing. It's a very radical and profound observation by this tribe, and it should rattle our cages a little bit about our misuse of divine naming.
Your book is tying together ideas of dozens of visionary thinkers, some from centuries ago, but most from the present day. You don't profess some patented ideas and prop yourself up with them, but you celebrate the commonalities across traditions and schools of thought, and show how interlocked and substantial our causes. What Meister Eckhart was saying 700 years ago in mystical language, astrophysicists are saying today, that against incredible odds, we emerge from rare elements found in stardust. It's from this reality that a universal story can take root. And as global society, we can reintegrate into the ecological framework of Earth. Not to make it sound easy, but it's theoretically possible. What are your thoughts regarding this?
Well, I think what you just said is wonderfully put and terribly important, and it excites me just to hear you speak it. I don't know if I have a right to ask you this, but I'm wondering how old you are. That is, what generation? Are you in your 20s or 30s? Because
I'm 27.
Terrific. I'm glad to hear that. And I sense that, because I think that your generation is asking many of these questions that you're putting forth today, including that issue of action and contemplation together, not either or, but also this question too, and the question about interfaith, what I call deep ecumenism, and of course the ultimate question, which is the survival of the planet as we know it, so the ecological question. So in this book, as you know, I end the book with 2 chapters that talk about what I call the 4 E's: ecology, ecumenism, education, and new economics. I think these 4 E's are what really should be preoccupying us today as a species, because if we can't deal with them, I don't think we're going to survive as a species. But as you say, there is hope, because we can deal with these. We're perfectly capable of creating economics that works for everyone on the planet, not just the 2-legged ones, but the other species as well, the forests and the oceans and the soil and the 4-legged creatures, so many of which are disappearing. We are capable of that as a species, but we have to wake up, and we have to roll up our sleeves and go to work. I love that definition of hope from David Orr, the eco-philosopher, who says hope is a verb with the sleeves rolled up. And I think that's where we're at. I think we've got to roll up our sleeves. And we have to admit, we have to get out of denial. We have to admit how bad things are, that the path we've been on for centuries is a suicidal path. It's not only bringing down our species, but it's bringing down many, many other species with us. Eckhart has a great line about denial. He says, God is the denial of denial. In other words, until we can get over denial, divinity will not flow, creativity will not flow, beauty will not flow, and healing will not flow, and justice will not flow. Here we have, at this time in history, we have a governor of the state of Florida who's in denial about climate change. I have a friend in Miami. He told me in South Miami today, he walked down the street and there's 6 inches of water on the sidewalk. And that's because South Miami is sinking, or if you will, the ocean is lapping over half of South Miami. So the power of denial and ideology cannot be underestimated. We humans are very brilliant, but we're also very stupid. And we're perfectly capable of living in our bubbles of ideology and anthropocentrism and capitalism, and things are just fine because the corporations are making money. Oh, and the stock market is up, so everything's just hunky-dory. That is such a world of denial, because the truth is that things are not hunky-dory for a lot of people who don't have work, and, of course, for the other species who are being endangered by the paths that humans have chosen to travel.
Like a bird on a wire, like a drunk in a midnight choir, I have tried in my way to be free. Like a worm on a hook, like a night in an old-fashioned book, I have saved all my ribbons for thee.
Human rights often win out against the rights of other beings or the rights of Mother Earth. But as Thomas Berry says, quote, "All rights are limited and relative. We have no right to disturb the basic functioning of the biosystems of the planet," end quote. So when it comes to humanitarian crisis, there are major donation drives and huge infrastructure for emergency response. But why is there no organized response to ecological crisis? What do we need to do to organize this kind of emergency response? What will it take for compassion to extend past human well-being?
Well, first let me say I love that quote from Thomas Berry, and I love Thomas Berry. He was one of my mentors, and great respect for him. I'll tell you, it's really interesting that you asked that. What can we do to organize an environmental movement more profoundly? Because I've been working recently, I just wrote something up about it, on the idea of a whole new spiritual order where people take a vow to be the best mystic and the best warrior they can be on behalf of Mother Earth. And a mystic is a lover, so it's about loving Mother Earth, and the warrior is, of course, defending what you cherish, what you love. If you look at history, like in the 5th century, St. Benedict launched the Benedictine order, the monastic movement, that because things were collapsing all around him in Rome, the Roman Empire had died the century before, and there was chaos everywhere. And it did help to hold culture together for about 6 centuries when things were very dark, because you had people who were able to read and write and publish manuscripts, because everything had to be written by hand and so forth, and agriculture. They were very good at agriculture and other things. So in the 13th century, you had Francis of Assisi, who also realized the corruption in the religion of the time, in the church, but he also felt that there was a way to spread the real teaching of Jesus, which was about defending the poor and defending other creatures and creation. And, of course, he started his movement of the Franciscans. But he was co-opted by the church. They insisted that he create this rule that the bureaucrats in Rome would approve of and everything. And it really killed him, literally. They took his order away from him 2 years before he died. And he didn't want to go that way. And within a generation after he died, his order was being used for the Inquisition. So he was intuitive and prophetic in that regard. So that's why, in order today, I think, to be independent, and must be, of any religious headquarters or bureaucracy or organization. And it could be ecumenical. In other words, everyone who believes, and I would include atheists too, everyone who has this question on their mind that you have, this all-important question: how can we preserve the earth and gather the energy of people, especially young people, to really throw themselves into this project? How can we do that? Well, I think a vow like that, just one vow, very simple. You'd welcome many lifestyles, you'd welcome many spiritual traditions, but what would bind us together is this vow, that we would all do our best and support one another and be a learning community, including, of course, studying science and psychology and applying it to ourselves and others, but also spiritual practices to calm the reptilian brain. I think something like this could be extremely useful at this time in history, because we're lacking. That's why I love your question so much, because you're implying we're lacking something that would hold us together at a level of depth, something that matters. And I want to remind people, of course, that a vow is not just a Western monastic thing. Gandhi took several vows in his life. So a vow is a way to focus. And today's young adults, they have so many options, so much on the table and so much in their iPhones and on the internet and Facebook, that focusing can be a real issue. So a vow helps you to focus your primary values. And then it's in front of you. And so all your decisions, whether it's about where you're going to work or what you're going to study or what kind of a citizen you're going to be, how you're going to vote or how you're going to run for office, whatever it is, how you're going to handle finances in your life, how you're going to handle relationships, having this value in front of you like that because of a vow helps you to clarify the decisions you make. It's going to make living a more simple lifestyle more joyful and easy. And of course, then you'll be part of a community, an ever-growing community that will nurture one another. Obviously, with the internet, you can get online, you can share stories, you can blog, and all the rest. And then you can also have meetings in person, especially locally and so forth. So that idea came to me just a month ago, but it was very strong. It came to me at 4 a.m, and the message I got was, do this. It wasn't, this might be a neat idea, or write a book about it. The message I got was, do this. I love your question. So this is the first time I've talked about this publicly. You really triggered this in me by your very profound question. What do you think of that?
Well, my first thought was I'd love to work together and collaborate on making this happen. I think that's incredible. Fabulous. And what you were saying about having that vow, focusing us, because it's so true that the amount of distractions going on in today's world with social media and options, but not really having options that are actually fulfilling.
Exactly.
Having a lot of empty options.
Matter. Exactly. Most of the options are about what you're going to buy, where the next sale is. Right. The options are an insult, really, to the depths of our existence. You know, people are deeper than consumer capitalism would like to define us. Let me give one concrete example. Stephen Jobs and the whole electronic revolution of our time, which I compared to the printing press invention that launched the modern era. Obviously, all these inventions are important, but, you know, on the back of my book here, Larry Dossey, who's a doctor who's done a lot of work on prayer and healing and things like that, he has this amazing statement about my book. He says, whether our species has a future on Earth does not depend on the development of more gee-whiz technologies, but on whether we're willing to move into the psycho-spiritual dimension proclaimed by Meister Eckhart and elucidated the Magic 5. Yeah, I mean, you can have gee-whiz technologies ad infinitum until you're buried with the latest iPhone 22 in your coffin. So something deeper in the human soul really needs attention. And I think that's what a community like this could help to articulate. So if you're excited too, then let's definitely stay in touch.
Absolutely.
Right.
You know, bringing up these distractions, we have these huge issues going on socially, environmentally, yet we are able to stay in this place of chronic dissatisfaction, and it makes it very easy to blame outside things for what's going on. And so it leads me to this thought about blaming God for what's going on, or creating this reason not to believe in a spirituality because some people say, well, how could God let this happen? Why are we going through what we're going through? Or maybe people say, well, yeah, sure, there's an extinction, but this is God's plan. And I'm not really sure what my question is, other than I feel a lot of discomfort over that.
Well, I commend you. You should. Both are, of course, flights from our own responsibility. The truth is that our species has a lot of power. We have a lot of intelligence and creativity, and we can use it to blow up the world if we want to, and destroy this world, this very earth as we know it. The earth itself, we're not going to destroy utterly, but we can certainly destroy many, many species and so much the beauty that's on the planet and all the rest. So we have to take our own powers seriously, both our powers for beauty and good and health and community and love, but also our powers for destruction and self-destruction. I think that's where most hatred begins, is in terms of self-hatred. Adrian Rich, the feminist poet and writer, on whom I have a chapter here, Interact with Meister Eckhart, she talks about the fatalistic self-hatred of men. She thinks that men, many men, have a fatalistic self-hatred. Well, I think that explains a lot of the violence that men get into. And again, I think part of it is theology. The original sin ideology encourages people to think badly about themselves. I met a Native American who works in prisons. It's impossible to get men in prison to look inside. They're always projecting onto others. He said, I've been looking for 12 years. Yours is the first book I've ever used that got men to look inside and find the nobility inside. And I just love that phrase, the nobility inside. That's finding the Buddha nature. That's finding the Christ inside. That's finding the image of God inside. We're not taught how to do that in our culture, especially not men. And so we're always waging these battles to defeat someone, because that's what the reptilian brain tells us is the way you triumph or you find some kind of satisfaction in this world. But we have to go much deeper than that. Yeah, what you're talking about is so important, and it's about community, isn't it? Rediscovering community, first of all, ourselves and the rest of nature, and all the other beings in nature, but also, obviously, then, community with our own species and beyond just our particular tribes. I do think there are some signs of progress in that regard. I think the whole gay marriage movement is quite amazing, really, that has gone on in our lifetime and has really changed a lot of people's minds about acceptance of diversity. Obviously, nature is very biased in favor of diversity. Diversity is what makes bioregions thrive, and it can make our species thrive. So diversity itself is a tremendous value, and out of it comes joy and celebration and art and creativity. So there's so much to be said about diversity at so many levels, but it's hard, obviously, for humans to, what should I say, get over their tribalism to allow a diversity to flourish, and that's one of the issues we have to deal with. There are a lot of shadows that we have as humans. Much of it comes from our animal ancestors. We're challenged at this time in history to move to another level of evolution, to an acceptance of diversity and learning to get along with people different from ourselves, and to honor that, as the French say, vive la différence, celebrate the differences, not go to war over them or deprive them of their own rights. Diversity and creativity are the new values that really have to put out there, and they're survival values. Without them, we're not going to survive, and the rest of creation, a lot of it will go down with us.
I'd like to read this quote from Otto Rank that appears in your chapter on creativity. Quote, "I don't explain my psychology to the patient, but let him develop himself, express himself. My aim is to enable the individual to first find himself and then to develop himself. I think the neurotic type is a failure of a creative type. The proof of good results is also creativity. If the therapist achieves a real therapeutic result, the patient will not only be able to adjust himself, but sometimes he adjusts the circumstances to himself, which means creation. His chief job is to create himself and then go on to create externally." Unquote. I love this quote, in part because the individual dilemma can be sized up to the level of society. This civilization is the neurotic patient, as we're systematically murdering the planet to prolong an illusion of domination over it. But I believe there's a collective vision spreading, a vision of an ecologically rooted society. As we admit our role in climate change, as we admit our interdependence with the rest of life. But to make it a reality is a massive project, and we don't really know where to begin. We are the Artiste Monkey, the blocked artist. We have the tools. We have permaculture, agroforestry, bioremediation, localized community. And there are indigenous people who can orient those who are unrooted. And here we are at the cusp of shared understanding of our place in the cosmos. Meister Eckhart's work and your work are a great service here. You're helping humanity find itself in order to recreate itself. So, how do you feel about that?
Well, again, beautifully said. I'm glad you picked up on Otto Rank. His thesis is that all neurosis is essentially the Artiste Monkey. It's humans misusing our creativity or sitting on it. And we use it, for example, when we're neurotic, to beat up on ourselves instead of to heal ourselves and get on with contributing. So I think he's onto something there for sure. Creativity is so essential to our species. This is what really sets us off, I think, from the other species, that we're more creative, and dangerously so. We can create gas ovens to kill the people we scapegoat, or we can create nuclear submarines, or we can tear down a rainforest in a day that has taken nature and God 10,000 years to give birth to. So our creativity is what gets us into our deepest trouble, but it is also our greatest asset. Part of the scandal, frankly, I think, is education. Education today barely touches on creativity. When there's a budget crunch in education, which is happening everywhere, out goes the theater department, out goes music, out goes art. And we wonder why the kids are bored in school, and so many are dropping out of school or dropping acid or something else. So creativity is totally underappreciated, I think, in our culture at this time. And Otto Rank, on the other hand, is a person who really steps up to the plate with that invitation. And like you say, I mean, see, creativity is the answer to our problems. So what we're capable of with solar energy and wind energy and our imaginations, I mean, we are capable of turning around this fossil fuel addiction that we have. But we have to start acting now, not generations from now, for this to happen. So the key really is an explosion of creativity. But it must be centered on values that count. That's one reason I think, again, a vow would make a difference, because it clarifies and it focuses, and it becomes almost a test. Is this an appropriate action? It's a choice to wallow in pessimism. Otto Rank also says pessimism comes from a repression of creativity. So there's a relation between pessimism and cynicism, or what I would call couch potatoitis, passivity, not doing anything but getting addicted to watching television and more sports and eating lots of potato chips while the earth is burning all around us. Academia's fiddling, government's fiddling, finance and Wall Street is fiddling, religion is fiddling, politics is fiddling, education is fiddling. We're all fiddling, and the whole darn world is burning. You know, your generation has to kind of blow the whistle, start shouting about this. This is not something one generation can solve. And I think that we have to work together, and as part of diversity, really, to get young and old alike working to heal the planet. If we share this common value about being mystics and warriors defending Mother Earth, then I think we'll find ways to give birth to alternative institutions and alternative ways of living on the earth. And as you say, it is happening. There's permaculture and there's many movements. We have to up the ante, and they have to become more visible, as you said. And of course, the whole media is an issue. Media is also fiddling. Media is feeding so much trivia and so much distraction, as you said. The distraction itself almost becomes the agenda. And we can be addicted to distraction. Addiction, of course, is a flight from your deeper feelings of joy and of commitment and of love. And it is easier to live a life of addiction and distraction than it is to live a full life. And we have to point this out, and we have to make it easier for people to live a full life and a committed life rather than just a life where you wander from one gadget to another or one high to another. This is where the practices of contemplation are important.
To quote Eckhart, and something you spoke about in your book that really, really hit my heart chords, quote, living and working without a why. If we always work for a why, we are no better than mercenaries, end quote. Well, at least in this historical moment, humanity stands at the crossroads of two very different futures, and the why that we are called to work for is glaringly obvious. I look forward to a time when every moment isn't so critical and we can engage our other callings, whether that's painting, music, art, not necessarily as activist tools, but just for the joy of engaging in beauty itself. So the perennial question I ask is, can we be activist in the spirit of joy and beauty and still achieve the urgent goals of this critical moment? Or is there an intrinsic sacrifice that goes along with staring into the eyes of evil for the sake of future generations experiencing that joy?
Well, I think it's both and. If you do not make room for your own joy, you will burn out. You'll also become a sourpuss. We must understand that the process is just as important as the goal. So that's why the way we live, to use theological language, when the phrase that Christ is the way, it's the way, not just the goal. The Buddha is the way. So it's very important to, first of all, to realize you're in here for the long haul. You don't want to burn out at 31. And you will if you do not take care of yourself and if you do not find the joy and the beauty along the way and the fun, too. One thing I've been involved in for a number of years is what we call the Cosmic Mass, which is ritual, and it's taking rave, dance, and multimedia and music, DJs, VJs, and everything into liturgy. In fact, we're having one this Sunday. The theme is the new cosmology. Of course, Burning Man would be another example of that, of power of ritual. So ritual should be fun, and as well as deep. And it should bring the whole community together in joy, and that helps to create hope, and it energizes people. Otherwise, one does burn out. So I think it's both and. We need to find a perspective. Now, I also think we have to travel very lightly with our practices. I talk about walking with backpacks on our back, not basilicas on our back. We have to find practices that are portable and that are simple and aren't overly long. Now, you asked about sacrifice, and that's an important question. It's a word you don't hear real often in our culture. But I do think that sacrifice, in the sense of letting go, letting be, is a part of the process for sure. And the habit that you learn, again, Eckhart talks a lot about letting go. He says we sink eternally from letting go to letting go into God. And so, in other words, our whole lifetimes are a series of letting go. And letting go is a sacrifice. It's like Jesus said, a woman in labor, when the baby is born, forgets the pain because the joy is so great. So I don't think we want to focus too much on sacrifice, But I do think we want to alert people, yeah, there's going to be sacrifice. There always is when you're doing something worthwhile. If you're learning to play the piano, there's sacrifice. You get backaches and hand aches. Life isn't easy. There is a sacrifice. Learning a friendship or learning how to get along in marriage, it's a give and take. And there's a certain amount of pain in the process. But you keep the goal before you, and then you're not sitting around counting the pain. You're enjoying the process, and you're enjoying the accomplishment of what you're building together.
I have probably hours of questions to continue asking you, so I'd love to have you back on.
Great.
But this has been really wonderful. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I just want to say I've enjoyed it very much, too. You've really done your homework. You understand Eckhart, and not only that, you've obviously been doing your own inner work and your own exploring. So I honor you for the depths of your questions. And I'm glad we had this conversation, and I hope we can have more.
Thank you for joining us for another edition of Unlearn and Rewild. And thanks to our producer, March Young. Our musical selections today were Drink Deep by Laura Veers, Bird on a Wire sung by Kate Wolf, and an instrumental by Fred Frith called Road Movie. Our theme song, Like a River, is also by Kate Wolf.
Drifting on the wind through the mountains like a river.